Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Grace. It is lovely to have you here. Today I would like to talk about some 2025 book releases that I am really excited for. I cannot believe how fast the end of year seems to be going. These last couple of months have just sped by, but I'm trying to get myself in the festive spirit by getting excited for things to come. And there are some releases coming out in 2025 that I am so incredibly excited for. Several are sequels to books that I have already read and had a great time with, and some are books by authors that I love, and some are just books that sound really interesting. I know nothing about the author, haven't read nothing by them before, but the concept sounds really intriguing. So let's get into it. I'm gonna go in release order, but do not quote me on these release dates. These are what Goodreads have told me most of the time, so things are probably still changeable, as they often are in the book world. But the first book I am really excited for supposedly comes out just on January 2nd, so right at the start of the year, and this is A Language of Dragons by S.F. Williamson. This is a young adult fantasy, which I don't read as much of these days, but this concept sounds so interesting and the cover is stunning. That's one of my favorite covers that I have seen in years. And I'm so sorry, but let me put the American cover up. This ain't it. Why do the UK have this stunning cover? And I'm so sorry, US, but this just is not doing it for me. But this is a young adult fantasy inspired by the code breakers of World War II at Bletchley Park, which I think is such an interesting thing for a fantasy book to be inspired by. So this is a historical fantasy set in an alternate version of London where there are dragons. And our main character just wants to study dragon languages, but ends up somehow accidentally starting a civil war, and then her parents get arrested and her sister goes missing. It's a big mess. And her only hope is that she gets recruited for a secretive code-breaking job, and if she succeeds in this role, then her family will be reunited and safe. But the more she learns as she starts to get to grips with these new codes, the more she wonders what war they are really fighting. That sounds so interesting to me. The idea of focusing on code breaking I think sounds really fun. I think that's going to add a layer of mystery to this one that I'm going to really enjoy, and I've been loving historical fantasies recently. I think this is set in the 1920s-ish, which I know doesn't quite line up with the timeline of the wars. I don't exactly know what's going on there, but either way, I'm sure it'll be fun. This is also meant to have a bit of an enemies to lovers plotline in there, and also discuss themes of class quite a bit, which I always find interesting if it's done well, so colour me intrigued. Then on January 14th, we have The Queen's Spade by Sarah Rawley. Now, I haven't really heard anyone talking about this book, but it sounds really interesting to me. This is a historical thriller, which is not something I ever thought I would be reading. I'm not really a thriller person, but I have been starting to get into historical fiction a little bit more in the last year, and I love, something about me is I love court intrigue, political intrigue in my fantasy stories, and this is a court intrigue based historical thriller. So I'm really interested to see if this will work for me. Apparently this one is loosely based on real historical events. It's set in 1862 and follows a 19-year-old African princess who has been kidnapped and desperately wants revenge and to kill her godmother, who just so happens to be Queen Victoria. So she embeds herself in court politics, she starts to manipulate the queen's inner circle, and ends up aligning herself with a dangerous but alluring crime lord. But when Queen Vic begins to suspect that Sally, our protagonist, is onto something, she traps her into an engagement. So Sally is now up against the clock, desperate to gain her own freedom, and the deadline is her own wedding. That sounds like such a fun time to me, and also like it will delve into some really interesting subjects of colonialism, the incredibly murky history of the British Royal Empire, and I think it could be a really interesting history lesson for me. Another book that comes out on that same day, January 14th, is Lightfall by Ed Crocker. And this is another one that's a bit out of my comfort zone. This is the beginning of an epic fantasy trilogy about vampires. And I haven't read too many books about vampires, especially not proper fantasy ones, but this one sounds really fresh and interesting to me because this is set in a world without humans, without mortals in a sense. In this setting, there are only vampires and other magical creatures like werewolves. And this one deals with themes of class again, because in this setting, poor vampires drink weak, diluted blood, and rich vampires get the good stuff. Now, our main character, Sam, is a palace maid who is sick of this situation, and when the son of the city's ruler is murdered and she finds the only clue to his death, she takes this as an opportunity to blackmail her way out of her situation. She ends up falling in with a bit of a ragtag bunch, a group of rebel maids called the Leeches, a sorcerer with incredible deductive skills even though his magic isn't great, a werewolf assassin, and a countess who just knows everyone's secrets. But the more they work together trying to solve this murder mystery, the more they uncover a conspiracy at the heart of this city. Wait, I love the last line of this blurb. It says, if she can avoid getting murdered, she might just live forever. So again, this one is heavy on the court intrigue and the mystery solving. I really didn't realize how into mysteries I was until this last year, because I read a certain book that I will be mentioning later, and I just think this sounds so different to any of the other vampire books out there, and I think this might just be the one that would work for me personally. Then on February the 11th, we have Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales by Heather Fawcett. This is the third and final, as far as I'm aware, book in the Emily Wilde's trilogy, which I have really enjoyed. I absolutely adored the first book. The second book I had a fun time with, I didn't love quite as much, but I have high hopes for the third one that it will wrap the series up very well. I'm not going to give a blurb of this one because I don't want to spoil anyone who's not started the series yet, but if you haven't, this is sort of a light academia fantasy, I would say, set in a historical version of our world where fairies are known to exist, and Emily Wilde is an expert scholar in how they work, different kinds of fae. In the first book, she is working on putting together her encyclopedia, hence the name, and she travels to an icy foreign land to finish off this document and study several species that are lesser known. But of course, her academic rival, Wendell, follows her, and there is something a little bit suspicious about him, but he's also frustratingly charming, both to her and to everyone around him, whereas she is a very grouchy, grumpy character. The combination of these two characters I absolutely adore. I always say if you enjoy Howl's Moving Castle and the dynamic between Sophie and Howl, it's not exactly the same, but it definitely has some of that essence to it. And I love the way that this series is written as well. It's epistolary, so you're reading Emily's notes to herself, her journals, as she goes on these academic explorations. So I'm really excited to see how Heather Fawcett is going to wrap this series up. Then heading into March, on March 4th, we have Oathbound by Tracy Dion. One of my favourite series of all time is the Legendborn cycle. This is a young adult fantasy set in our world. The first book follows 16-year-old Brie Matthews, whose mother has recently passed away in an accident that she thinks there is more to than meets the eye, but she is trying to put her past behind her and start this new program for bright high schoolers at a local university. But when she gets there, she ends up tangled up with a secret society who call themselves Legendborn, hunt down demon creatures, and claim to be linked magically somehow to King Arthur. And the more Brie uncovers, the more she thinks that maybe this has a connection to what happened to her mother. This is such a gripping series, and it has so many interesting themes that are delved into with such depth and care. Brie is a Black American teen in a very white space, especially within this secret society, so we end up dealing with a lot of racism as well as sexism, and this perfectly balances dealing with heavy topics like generational trauma with just all of the fun, exciting elements that you would find in a classic teen fantasy. The romance in here is great, the mysteries that we're solving and the action. I was so hooked, and the second book was a little confusing, honestly. I would recommend not doing what I did and reading them several years apart, but I did still have a great time with it. I think I'm definitely going to need to reread the first two before I get to the third one, but I really cannot wait to see where Tracy Deonn is going to take the rest of this series. Also coming out on March 4th is The River Has Roots by Amal El-Mahtar, and I am so excited for this one because Amal El-Mahtar is one of the co-authors of This Is How You Lose the Time War, which, oh man, I love it so much. It's so gorgeously written. Really just blew my mind when I read it, so I cannot wait to read another book by Amal El-Mahtar. And this is a fae story. This is the story of two sisters who live in a little town on the edge of fairy, and they tend to and harvest the ancient magical willows that grow there, as well as singing to them to thank them for their magic. These two sisters, Esther and Isabel, have an incredible bond. They're very close, but one day when Esther rejects a very forceful suitor in favour of a different lover in fairy, she puts both of their lives at risk. It's a bit of a brief blurb, but it is quite a short book. I think it's only about 140 pages, and I don't really want to know anymore. I'm really just ready to sink into this author's writing again. I think it's going to be so lyrical and experimental, and I think that writing will suit perfectly a setting near fairy. I just can't wait to dive headfirst into this one. Then on March 11th we have a book that I had never heard of until I started researching for this video. I believe this is a debut. This is What Wakes the Bells by El Tesh. The concept of this one really hooked me. This is set in a sentient city, of which our main character Mina is a keeper, which means that her job is to keep the city safe by stopping the bells from ringing, because if they do, they will awake a slumbering evil that no one fully understands. This is her family's legacy and she takes her job very seriously, but when one day her bell rings 13 times, the city descends into chaos. Gargoyles and statues begin coming to life and chasing people through the streets, and the soul of a twisted, power-hungry saint who had been trapped within Mina's bell has now been released and is hiding behind the faces of citizens of this city. So now there is no one that Mina can trust, and her only hope is to kill the host of this corrupted saint. But how far is she willing to go, and who is she willing to kill to save her city? That sounds so interesting to me. Apparently it's inspired by a Prague legend. The gothic vibes here sound impeccable, and the paranoia that this protagonist must be feeling throughout sounds like it's just gonna be so gripping. I think this is such an exciting concept, and I really hope that the writing will pull through on this one. Obviously I've never read from this author before, but I'm excited to give this story a chance. Then on April 1st of all days, we have probably my most anticipated release of next year, and this is A Drop of Corruption by Robert Jackson Bennett. Now, I mentioned earlier that a certain book had gotten me really into mysteries this year, and that is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett, which is the first one in this series, and this is still my favourite book that I've read so far this year. We'll see if that could change by the end of the year, but I devoured this book. I did not expect to love it the way that I did, but I was so incredibly hooked. The world that this series is set in is so intriguing. Within this setting, every few seasons, giant, terrifying monsters or leviathans come out of the sea and attack the people of this land. And this is used to explore class and hierarchy in such an interesting way, because obviously if you live closer to the edge of the land, closer to the sea, then you are much less safe than if you live in the center of this continent. So the poorest members of this society live closer to the sea, and the richest members live right in the middle in the capital, behind many walls. The magic system is also so interesting in here because it comes from these felled leviathans. Any leviathans that the defenses of this land manage to take down can then be stripped for parts, basically, and their parts are magical, so they can then be grafted onto people to give them augmentations. And our main character, Din, has one of these augmentations that gives him a perfect memory. And Din is an apprentice to a brilliant detective. It's a very Sherlock and Watson inspired relationship between the two, but the first book begins with Din taking evidence from a crime scene of a murder where a man has been killed because a giant tree has grown out of his body. Like I said, I didn't know how much I loved a mystery until I read this book, but the way that this one spirals from one mystery to the next and bursts out into something bigger, and you put things together along with our characters who are both so endearing. I loved everything about this book, from the world building to the characters to the plot. Everything was just chef's kiss. And just as everything began to spiral within that first book, I think that Robert Jackson Bennett left a lot of room for things to grow even further as the series progresses. So I'm really excited to see where the corruption in Drop of Corruption will take us. Oh, I'm so excited for this book. Then on April 8th, we have The Geographer's Map to Romance by India Halton. This is the second in the Love's Academic series, but this is kind of one of those fantasy romance series where you probably could read them as standalones. I think you might have a little bit more world context if you read the first one first, which is The Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love, but they each follow a different couple and a different romance. This is a historical fantasy rom-com, I believe set around the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. And this is about two magical geography professors who are trapped in a marriage of convenience. They are both experts in magical disasters who have been avoiding each other nearly since their wedding day, but both secretly pining for each other, it seems. But when magic erupts in a small Welsh village and threatens the rest of the UK, they are forced to come together as they are both assigned for the case. And I'm sure chaos and a lot of emotions will ensue. India Halton's writing is quite silly in the perfect way. Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love is one of my favourite books I've read this year. It really took me by surprise. I have really solidified in the last year that one of my favourite, probably the favourite subgenre of mine, is historical fantasy romance, or some people call it fantasy of manners, I think, which I love. And India Halton writes it with so much whimsy and humour, so much wit. The best way I can describe her is she is clearly someone who has a great love of romance as a genre, and she takes all of those tropes and spins them with such love and care, but also humour. It's a little self-referential and just so fun, and I really cannot wait for another installment in this series. Another book set to come out on April 8th that I've had my eye on for a while now is A Palace Near the Wind by Ai Jiang. This is a science fantasy novella. I think it's under 200 pages, and it's set in a world with both human people and the Feng people, who are sometimes called windwalkers because they have power over the wind, and they are very inhuman. They have bark faces, they have arms that are braided branches, but our main character, who is the eldest princess of Feng royalty, must marry the human king in order to stop the humans from expanding their territories further and taking over the lands of the Feng. Now, our princess, Lu Feng, desperately wants these marriages to stop so that she can protect her family, her younger sister, so she decides that she is going to use this opportunity to kill the king and finally end these marriages. But the more she learns, the more she realizes that her family and her sisters will never be safe from the humans, and she has to break from duty and tradition in order to free her family and her people. The themes of nature in here and colonization, nature versus industrialization, I find really interesting. I absolutely love when a book, especially a book with fantasy elements to it, takes those elements as an opportunity to explore climate issues in our real world. That's something that really grips me. It's something in the real world that plays a lot on my mind, so I'm always really intrigued to hear that a fantasy or sci-fi author has taken an opportunity to focus on those themes. This is another author that I have never read from before, but I was really hooked by that premise, so I'm hoping that this one will deliver for me. And then on April 22nd, we have a book by one of my favourite authors. This is Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry. I know everyone is talking about this book, everyone is excited, at least in the romance sphere. I am not particularly a solid contemporary romance reader myself, but I am an Emily Henry reader till I die. Happy Place is one of my favourite books of all time, and I think nearly all of her books have made me cry. There is something about the way that she writes characters that just works so well for me, so I'm always excited for new work from her. I am intrigued by the concept of this one. This is again about two writers, which is something that Emily Henry has written before. Alice Alice is an optimist. She is very friendly and she loves people, but she doesn't have any real serious publications under her belt. Whereas Hayden is very grumpy and cynical, but he is a Pulitzer Prize winner. So when they both travel to a little island for the same reason, to write the biography of a woman no one has seen in years, whose family has a very scandalous history, and she decides to give them both a month trial period, Alice can't understand why Hayden seems to see her as competition, but she knows she's ready for this job and she knows that she likes people and therefore they seem to like her most of the time. So she's hoping she can win Margaret, the subject of these biographies, over. But this becomes more and more difficult as the two of them realise that Margaret is only giving them each hints of the story that they can't swap because they've both signed an NDA, and because of developing feelings between the two. This sounds like a lot of fun. I'm always really interested in the other things that are going on in Emily Henry books besides the romance itself. I think that she writes friends and family of our main characters really, really well, and I think that Margaret sounds like a really interesting character. I do worry a little bit that our main characters here sound a lot like the main characters in Beach Read, but I really enjoyed Beach Read, so I'm not gonna have a bad time with this. But hopefully she can make them distinct from those characters and bring something fresh to the table here. I will say I didn't love Funny Story as much as her other books, which is her most recent release. I know not everyone feels that way. I know a lot of people loved that book, but it didn't quite work for me for some reason. So I'm hoping she can pull it back for me with this one, but I'm very excited to get my hands on it. Then on March 6th, we have A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping by Sangu Mandana. Sangu Mandana is the author of The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which I know everyone read and loved, including myself. I had a great time with that book, and she is known for writing found family, cozy, witchy stories that are set in our world but have a lot of magic and a bit of romance to them. And the concept of this one honestly sounds even more interesting to me than her first book. This is the story of a witch called Sarah Swan, who used to be one of the most powerful witches in England, but then she rescued her great aunt Jasmine from the dead, lost most of her powers, and was exiled from her magical guild. Somewhere in the mix she also befriended a slightly evil talking fox, I think. Now she a bit grumpily helps out at her great aunt's inn, where she has to deal with a lot of quirky guests, try to keep this fox under control, and she spends a lot of her time longing for what could have been if her magic hadn't been lost. But when she learns about an old spellbook that could hold the secret to her regaining her magical abilities, she finds herself turning to an icy but gorgeous historian called Luke, who happens to be a man that she had a one-night stand with years ago. And she may just find that this family that has come together through circumstance may just be the best magic of all. Themes like this always get me the idea of losing a skill that you once had. I'm not going to go into it, but I relate. And the fun, chaotic nature of the characters in here sounds like it's going to be really heartwarming and endearing. And I just had a great time with Sangu Mandana's other books, so I'm really intrigued to see what she will do with this one. I know it's been a little longer coming than expected, but I always really respect when an author takes the time and doesn't rush to get a book out for deadline. I hope that that means that this is going to be really polished and everything that she wanted it to be, so I'm excited to get to this one. And last but not least, on June 10th, we have Ordinary Love by Marie Rutkowski. Now, Marie Rutkowski is one of my favorite authors of all time. She wrote the Midnight Lie duology. Midnight Lie is one of my favorite books ever, and she also wrote the Winner's Curse trilogy. She also wrote a thriller, which I did not read because I'm too much of a coward, but I have loved everything else that I've read of hers. Her writing is so sublime and gorgeous, and it also has a special place in my heart because Midnight Lie was one of the first sapphic books that I ever read, believe it or not, and this is her first time writing a contemporary romance instead of a fantasy romance. This is the story of Emily and Jennifer, who fell in love as teenagers but have since grown apart. 20 years down the line, Jen is an Olympic runner and Emily lives what seems to be a picture-perfect life with 2 young children and a wealthy husband, but his behaviour has been growing becoming more and more controlling, and she's beginning to realize that she has lost sight of who she really is. So when these two women reunite years down the line, despite Emily's fracturing marriage and the pressures of Jen's career, they find themselves drawn together again, and maybe they can have a second chance at love. I didn't realize how much I loved a second chance romance until I read Happy Place, and it absolutely destroyed me. So reading a sapphic second chance romance by one of my favorite authors sounds like the perfect combination to me. I'm really excited to see Marie Rutkowski's writing within a genre that I'm not used to her writing in, and I have a feeling this one is going to be pretty devastating, so I'm excited. So those are all of the books that are currently on my radar for next year. I'm sure I have missed several, and if you have any that you are particularly excited for, I would love to hear about them so I can be excited with you. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being here through this first year on my channel. I cannot believe that it's nearly been a year. That is wild. I hope you're having the loveliest day, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye bye.